factory in China exploded near Wuhan, killing 6 people. A city in China has issued a red warning for mountain torrents as heavy rain continues and a typhoon moves closer to Shanghai. And the U.S. Embassy in Beijing is now holding an auction of its furniture. This is raising concerns of further breaks in U.S.-China diplomacy. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. There was an explosion near Wuhan, the epicenter of the novel coronavirus, and the explosion killed 6 people and injured 4 on August 3rd. The explosion was at a chemical factory in Xiantao City. Videos of the fire showed a tower of black smoke over the building, and additional video footage showed the impact of the blast. The case of the incident is being investigated. Meanwhile, on August 2nd, a fire broke out in the logistics park in Foshan City in Guangdong Province. Videos showed a large fire burned out cars that were parked nearby and dense billowing smoke. The cause of the fire is still unknown, and there's not yet information on whether anyone was harmed. And a lightning strike was captured on film, setting fire to high-voltage power lines in Shenyang City in Liaoning Province. About an hour later, the Liaoning Provincial Meteorological Department issued a warning about the lightning and warned areas throughout the province that the lightning could be accompanied by severe weather such as rain, gales, and hail. Meanwhile, with the 2 typhoons that have made landfall in China, the CCP's National Meteorological Center said that one of the typhoons made landfall in Zhejiang Province around 3:30 a.m., with winds blowing up to 85 miles per hour at its center. And at 5 a.m. on August 3rd, the Joint Typhoon Warning Center noted it had maximum sustained winds near 75 miles per hour, making it a Category 1 hurricane, if we believe the Chinese Communist Party's numbers on this. Now, many roads and traffic in Zhejiang Province were shut off. Linhai City issued a red warning for mountain torrents. Videos showed that trees were uprooted when the typhoon passed. Billboards on the road were blown down, heavy rain soaked the streets, and local residents walked through thigh-high waters. The typhoon is now moving towards Shanghai, one of the major cities in China, and already Shanghai's 2 major airports have canceled 572 inbound and outbound flights. Many lines of ferries have been suspended, as well as lines of buses and trains. Scenic sites have also been temporarily closed, and outdoor movie screenings in 7 commercial districts have also been canceled. In Wenzhou, authorities issued their highest warning for typhoons as well, which is code red. And meanwhile, in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, it is now holding an auction to sell off items including furniture and electrical appliances. Videos showed many people lined up at the auction site, and the auction itself has raised questions over whether it might be a sign of further breaks in diplomatic relations between China and the United States. Now, there's a bit more on this. This is being taken in context of the fact that the U.S. closed the Chinese embassy in Houston and that the Chinese Communist Party responded by closing the U.S. embassy in Chengdu, China. And also, the U.S. government is talking about possibly restricting the number of Chinese diplomats allowed in the United States, restricting the numbers to the number of U.S. diplomats being allowed in China. And the Trump administration has also said that it is possible that other U.S. consulates or Chinese consulates might be closed. What's happening now in Beijing is, of course, again being taken in context of this. And in the United States, meanwhile, the Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI have released information on hacking tools used by the Chinese regime for more than a decade. It revealed that since 2008, the CCP was using malware known as Tidor to target government agencies, think tanks, and other organizations, and had methods through this of keeping access to the infected computers to maintain spy operations. And meanwhile, as talks continue on a possible ban of Chinese social media app TikTok in the United States, President Donald Trump has declared TikTok must end its U.S. operations by September 15, yet has backed a potential purchase of the app by Microsoft. Now, there are different proposals on the table. One of them is that Microsoft might buy a 30% stake in TikTok, that the Trump administration is pushing for a full purchase. But Trump advisor Peter Navarro, one of the leading experts on China, author, for example, of Death by China, which was also a documentary, is also warning about Microsoft itself and its relationships to the Chinese Communist Party, and is himself saying that maybe that is not even enough, pushing for possibly a full ban of TikTok or for another company to buy it. Now, Trump said this.
I set a date of around September 15th, at which point it's going to be out of business in the United States. But if somebody, and whether it's Microsoft or somebody else, buys it, that'll be interesting.
And Zhang Yiming, the CEO of ByteDance, a Chinese company that owns TikTok, said the forced sale of TikTok may be inevitable. And some Chinese netizens responded to his plans by declaring that he's a traitor to the Chinese Communist Party. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first off, the United States is now restricting the sale of semiconductors to Chinese telecom company Huawei. And this is sending deep reverberations across China's high-tech industries and the CCP's agendas for next-generation technologies. Now, let me explain. The Chinese Communist Party still has a pathway to buy these chips through Hong Kong that is currently being closed. But recent reports suggest that Chinese companies are trying to use this pathway through Hong Kong again to buy up as many chips as possible before this loophole is closed. Now, Bloomberg reported that Chinese companies, including Huawei, are stockpiling chips to keep their supply chains flowing, at least for the near future. So what are we saying here? Now, when it comes to Huawei, when it comes to the CCP's different agendas, this ties into two of its main programs, China 2025 and the One Belt, One Road initiative. And so what are these? China 2025 was a rebranding of Project 863, and it ties into the CCP's deeper agendas when it comes to its goals on developing high-tech economies. One of the phrases the CCP has, one of the terms it uses, is surpass you at the turning point. And what does that mean? It refers to the idea they believe that it's very hard to compete with companies on existing technologies. In other words, building, for example, the same products as Apple or Microsoft, when it comes to something that's already on the marketplace, it's very hard for them to beat them on that. And so what they're doing is they're looking to next generation technologies. They're looking to build the next generation of these technologies, which ties into things like economic theft, where they're stealing IP, intellectual property, from these different companies, using that IP to basically put a different polish on it, and then releasing a product based on the same product these companies were developing, and using that to compete with them on the international market. Now, if the CCP loses its semiconductors, these microchips, that means that basically the foundational technologies in these is lost. It could no longer, for example, make a phone that could compete with the iPhone. It would be like, for example, selling an iPhone 4 in a market where people have the iPhone 11 in terms of generational technology. The CCP cannot currently develop chips on the current generation level, which means that if it loses these chips, the CCP becomes several generations behind other countries when it comes to the technological markets. And so really this is a crippling blow to the CCP when it comes to its agenda in this regard. Also, Huawei, this company that's being hit the hardest, is part of the backbone of the CCP's One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, the One Belt, One Road initiative is the method the CCP is using, say the train it is using to go into different countries around the world, Latin America, Africa, different parts of Asia, even now some Western countries, Australia, for example, different parts of the EU, and parts of Canada, for example. And it's going into these countries and it's getting them in debt traps. It's making them sign agreements with the CCP, basically sometimes even making bribes to high-level officials in these countries who are then selling out essentially the people of their own countries in exchange for whatever the CCP is giving them. You might remember in a previous episode we talked about the CCP's use of palace diplomacy, where it's going into parts of Africa and it's building palaces for different political leaders there. This is part of the bribery the CCP is using. It makes deals with these countries that they cannot pay back. It gives them loans they cannot pay back. And when they default on these loans, the CCP gains control over the local infrastructure or natural resources. And so in other words, it goes into these countries, builds infrastructure, builds critical, say, foundational technologies such as cables and telecom systems and so on. Once they default on it, the CCP owns it. Huawei is one of the main companies it uses for this, Huawei being one of the largest telecom companies in the world. And so when they go in and build, for example, 5G systems, internet infrastructure, Huawei has these technologies in there. And so if Huawei gets crippled, the CCP loses the backbone of this entire program. And in addition to this, the United States and other countries are even putting different restrictions on Huawei itself when it comes to 5G technologies. And so the US is hitting them on multiple fronts. And again, this directly impacts the CCP's agendas with China 2025 and the One Belt, One Road initiative, two of its main programs to export the China model to the rest of the world. Now, in other news, an investigation by ESPN has exposed foul play in the NBA's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, again, the National Basketball Association. It alleges, among other points, that the NBA ignored human rights abuses tied to its camps in China, and also that the NBA took steps to silence its employees. Now, author and radio host Clay Travis stated on Twitter, quote, ESPN just dropped an atomic bomb on the NBA's China relationship. Story alleges NBA turned blind eye to massive human rights abuses, and league's own camps looked like they were from Nazi Germany. NBA also told employees not to comment on China for the story. Now, this article comes out as the Chinese Communist Party is being investigated and sanctioned for its human rights abuses in Xinjiang, which includes slave labor. And the NBA, which stated that it severed ties with the camp already, is being questioned on its CCP ties and potential abuses around the camp. Now, the ESPN article states, quote, American coaches at 3 NBA training academies in China told league officials their Chinese partners were physically abusing young players and failing to provide schooling. Now, this does seem to be on the lighter side of the accusations, but we'll see what else comes out from this. So what are we seeing here? Now, you might remember some of the stories of the NBA silencing its employees from commenting on these democracy protests in Hong Kong. And this was an example, when that took place, of the CCP exporting its censorships into the US. Now the NBA is being exposed for having deeper ties to the CCP. This article from ESPN details a lot of this, including to human rights abuses and also these Xinjiang slave camps. And so the National Basketball Association, again, while playing up all this virtue signaling and different narratives in the West, was directly engaged with the Chinese Communist Party in areas where human rights abuses are being carried out, including of actual slave labor in China. This is bringing up a bigger point. Companies are being tied to human rights abuses in China, mainly in Xinjiang currently, but this could really spread to other parts of China as well, and to other companies involved with different types of human rights abuses in China. Now, the main controversy many of them are being tied to is the slave labor camps in Xinjiang. The Chinese Communist Party has different programs to persecute these Muslim Uyghurs, one of the different ethnic groups in China. And when it comes to these groups, the CCP is using them for slave labor, including in the cotton industry. It's coming out now that most of the apparel industry internationally does appear to have some ties to this, at least in their supply chains. And it's not limited either to the, say, apparel industry, but also to the car companies, to different big businesses. And what are we seeing, again, on the broader scale of this? When it comes to the NBA and what it's being exposed of doing, when it comes to different, say, shoe companies and different clothing companies and different car manufacturers, what are we seeing? We're seeing that their involvement with the CCP is coming back on them. They are being called out, at the very least, currently criticized by the international community for having involvement with human rights abuses in China. This means that Western companies are being held liable, at least to some extent currently. And the CCP's abuses of its own people when it comes to these types of things aren't just limited to Muslim Uyghurs. It ties to the entire system of re-education through labor. Now, you might remember one of the better-known stories on this. Several years ago, there was an individual in the United States who opened up a package of Halloween decorations, and inside that package was a letter which was a cry for help. An individual at one of these slave camps in China, this individual practiced Falun Gong and was enslaved by the CCP in one of these camps, wrote about, say, how they were calling for the international community to respond to the case. Now, the individual talked about how he was enslaved by the CCP and was being forced to make Halloween decorations, which were being exported to the West. Now, this has been exposed in many different areas. Halloween decorations, Christmas decorations, different holiday decorations, apparel industry, again, different major companies doing manufacturing in China. What is going to happen? What is the trajectory of this? We could say at the very least, this could be a very large blow to their national image or international image. When it comes to these different businesses during a time when they're talking about, say, virtue signaling and criticizing the history of the United States, as they're saying this, being involved in slave labor in China. This could be a major blow to their brands. In addition to this, there's also the possibility that individuals within these companies could be held liable for these crimes. Now, if it turns out that these companies were aware that this was taking place in China with their different business ties, which is something the NBA is being accused of partly in this ESPN story, it means that they could really be held liable when it comes to knowingly being involved in human rights abuses in China. And if that happens, we could see what happens to these individuals. Really, we could see if the full picture of what the Chinese Communist Party has been doing to its own people, hundreds of millions of people persecuted through its different campaigns. Really, we could see Nuremberg-type trials against Chinese Communist Party officials, and many Western companies could also be swept up in that. And meanwhile, as pressure mounts on the Chinese Communist Party from abroad, rather than backing down on its hostile policies, the CCP is doubling down. When it comes to Hong Kong, the regime has declared it will no longer recognize UK passports for Hong Kongers. The CCP is pushing back harder on the United States and Australia for criticizing its regime and its policies. With Italy, the CCP is pushing the local leadership there for support as it increases its soft power campaigns in Europe, and this is as the EU, the European Union, is discussing taking a unified stance against the CCP. Now, the CCP also declared August 3rd that it will suspend its extradition agreement with New Zealand in response to Wellington suspending its existing extradition treaty with Hong Kong. And despite the United States restating its intentions to support and back Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party is showing stronger signs of its agendas to take Taiwan by force. So what are we seeing here? Now, when it comes to the UK passports, the deeper context of this is that the United Kingdom, as the Chinese Communist Party implements these national security laws in Hong Kong and has effectively ended this agreement of autonomy with Hong Kong, the UK has been talking about extending and creating a path to citizenship for Hong Kongers who still have these passports from the time when Hong Kong was a UK colony. And the Chinese Communist Party now, in response to that, is taking away their passports. It's making it so people from Hong Kong cannot escape to the UK. Also, when it comes to meeting criticism with harsher criticism, as the Chinese Communist Party is doing on many different fronts, the CCP is again using this wolf warrior diplomacy. It is meeting like with like, and it's having the opposite effect. The CCP, anytime it's criticized of anything, comes out and criticizes back. Instead of backing down, instead of reforming itself, instead of apologizing for its wrongdoing, it is coming out and attacking these different countries on the exact same grounds, oftentimes even making statements that have no basis in reality. And this ties into what we're seeing, for example, with New Zealand.
Well, 1997 there was a one country, two systems commitment by China. It's clear now that the law is no longer what it was, and therefore the extradition arrangements we have don't stand up. But if they should go back to honouring the commitment of 1997, then we'd revisit our situation as well.
Now, New Zealand ended its extradition treaty with Hong Kong because under the Chinese Communist Party's new national security laws, international citizens, including people possibly from New Zealand, risk being extradited to Hong Kong and possibly to mainland China from there for committing crimes such as criticizing the CCP. There are many countries now worried about their extradition treaties with Hong Kong and what that means when it comes to these national security laws. And how does the CCP respond? It responds by doing the same thing with New Zealand. It also cut off its extradition treaty with New Zealand. And when it comes to right now what the CCP is doing with trying to use Italy as a pathway into Europe, this ties to bigger things as well. The Chinese Communist Party has pretty close ties to the Italian government. Now, the Chinese Communist Party, for example, even has police, CCP police, patrolling the streets in Rome. The CCP is very close to Italy. But at the same time, the EU, the European Union, is talking about uniting when it comes to responding to the CCP. The Chinese Communist Party's diplomatic approach to the EU is to go to each country within it individually. It does not want to deal with the EU as a whole. It wants to deal with the EU as a, say, balkanized country by country, policy by policy. If the EU responds in a unified way, it makes it very difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to exert pressure on it. And so the CCP is trying to use Italy as a pathway to disrupt that. And again, when it comes to Taiwan, the Chinese Communist Party has direct statements, direct military training programs, and direct policies on retaking Taiwan. The United States has taken a stronger stance on defending Taiwan in the face of this. And this includes, for example, sailing aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait, something that's not taken place for a long time. The United States is also reiterating its agreement to protect Taiwan in the case of the CCP trying to forcefully take it. And in Taiwan, really the situation there is being seen in regards to what the CCP recently did in Hong Kong, where out of nowhere the people in Hong Kong, having lived their whole lives in really a democratic country to some extent, woke up and found themselves under the totalitarian heel of the Chinese Communist Party. And people in Taiwan are realizing now that the idea that this could happen to them is not so far-fetched. And the Chinese Communist Party has again also been very direct with statements of that intention.
中华人民共和国实现祖国的统一，那是大势所趋。任何企图要分裂中国的势力，必须要对此有清醒的认识。
And so again, what's the bigger picture here? The Chinese Communist Party is being criticized internationally, internally, and also has really internal, within its own factions, different conflicts. It's being hit from just about every angle. Rather than backing down and looking at itself and trying to change, rather than reforming its policies, rather than, say, taking a step back and agreeing and, let's say, talking about changing its ways, the Chinese Communist Party is doubling down. And we can see across the board, when it's doubling down, when it comes out and criticizes Western countries, when it comes out and attacks them even more harshly and more directly, when it has criticized itself, this is having the opposite effect. The Chinese Communist Party is further isolating itself from the international community by taking this approach. Now, with that said, folks, we're again broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And also, if you want to support us, please join us on Patreon. The link is in the description below. If you haven't already, please also don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.